In September of AD 476, a young emperor named Romulus Augustulus was removed from the Western throne. Later generations turned that scene into a convenient ending. A Germanic commander dismissed the last emperor, and Rome fell. The event was real, and the invasions that preceded it were devastating. But the famous date explains almost nothing about why the Western government had become so weak that an emperor could be removed without the machinery of empire rising to defend him. Rome had survived lost battles, murdered rulers, epidemics, rebellions, and foreign invasions before. What it could not survive indefinitely was the destruction of the system that converted fields into taxes, taxes into soldiers, and soldiers into control over more fields. The Western Empire did not first lose its courage. It lost the fiscal engine that made imperial power possible. To understand that engine, begin not in a palace but in a field. Across Egypt, North Africa, Syria, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and the Balkans, farmers harvested grain-pressed olives, tended vines, raised animals, and paid rents to landowners. A portion of this production eventually reached the Roman state as tax requisition or compulsory service. Some obligations were paid in coin. Others arrived as grain oil cloth animals transport or labor. Local officials recorded land households and productive capacity. Warehouses gathered supplies, carts moved them toward rivers and ports, ships carried them across the Mediterranean. At the end of this chain stood the army, hundreds of thousands of men who needed food every day, replacement weapons, uniforms, horses, fortifications, and regular rewards for service. Roman power looked military at the frontier, but behind every fort was an accounting system. This was not simply a machine for taking wealth from the provinces and sending it to Rome. Taxation also forced goods and money to move. A landowner who owed coin had to sell produce. A merchant who supplied a military district had reason to connect distant markets. Soldiers spent their pay near forts, creating demand far from the old Mediterranean cities. The historian Keith Hopkins proposed that Roman taxation and state expenditure helped stimulate trade by drawing resources from tax-producing provinces and spending them in administrative centers, cities, and frontier zones. Hopkins presented the model cautiously because the evidence is incomplete, and the empire was never one uniform economy. Yet the central insight matters. The state did not merely sit above Roman commerce. Its taxes, roads contracts, garrisons ports, and grain distributions helped create the geography in which commerce operated. The army was therefore both Rome's shield and its largest recurring commitment. Emperors could postpone repairs, reduce ceremonies, or pressure cities for extraordinary contributions. They could not ignore soldiers for long. A frontier unit that lacked food became ineffective. An army denied pay became politically dangerous. A successful general surrounded by loyal troops could become a candidate for the throne, whether he planned to or not. This created a brutal institutional logic. The emperor needed the army to remain emperor, but satisfying the army required more revenue, and raising more revenue could intensify resistance in the provinces. Military success protected the tax base. Military failure damaged it. Civil war was even worse because the state spent its own resources destroying its own soldiers, while farms, roads, and frontiers remained exposed. That logic became visible after the death of Alexander Severus in AD 235. For nearly half a century, emperors and usurpers rose and fell with extraordinary speed. Roman armies fought Persians in the East Germanic groups along the Rhine and Danube, separatist regimes in Gaul and Palmyra, and one another. The crisis was not continuous everywhere, and some provinces remained productive. But the imperial system was repeatedly forced to pay for simultaneous emergencies. Troops were moved from one frontier to another, leaving gaps behind them. Rival claimants promised donatives to secure military support. Mints produced enormous quantities of coin to meet obligations that could not wait for a peaceful harvest or a successful tax collection. A government built to extract resources through predictable administration increasingly relied on emergency improvisation. One small coin reveals the scale of the problem. Caracalla had introduced the Antoninianus in AD 215 and valued it at 2 denarii, although it contained only about 1.5 denarii's worth of silver. Later emperors reduced its precious metal content further. By the darkest decades of the 3rd century crisis, Many Antoniniani were essentially bronze coins covered with a thin silver wash. This did not produce one simple empire-wide version of modern hyperinflation. Prices varied by region. Many obligations were paid in kind, and historians still debate the precise relationship between debasement and inflation. But the coin exposed a widening gap between the state's promises and the metal behind them. The government could stamp a higher value onto currency. It could not command soldiers, merchants, or taxpayers to trust that value forever. As confidence weakened, the state sought things that could not be debased by decree: grain, cattle cloth, leather carts, and human labor. Military supply increasingly depended on assessments and collections, in kind commonly associated with the annona militaris. This was practical. A sack of grain could feed soldiers regardless of what happened to the coinage. But it also pushed the burden closer to the producer. The state had to estimate what a district could yield, assign quotas, gather the goods, prevent theft, and move bulky supplies over long distances. Every stage required officials' records, animals, storehouses, and armed protection. The empire was not abandoning administration for barter. It was building a more intrusive administrative system because the older monetary shortcuts had become unreliable. Diocletian, who became emperor in AD 284, understood that the crisis could not be solved by issuing a better coin alone. The empire's frontiers were too distant, its succession too violent, and its emergencies too numerous for one court to control effectively. His answer was the tetrarchy: two senior emperors and two junior colleagues, stationed closer to the military zones they were expected to defend. The empire remained one Roman state, but power was distributed among several courts. The arrangement placed decision-makers nearer the Rhine-Danube and eastern frontier. It also multiplied palaces, staffs, armies, ceremonies, and administrative offices. Diocletian's solution made the state more responsive. It also made it more expensive. To support that larger structure, the government tried to measure the empire more systematically. Land was assessed according to its productive capacity. People and labor obligations were counted in different ways across different provinces. Historians often summarize this complex process with the terms eugatio and capitatio. But there was no perfectly identical formula imposed on every village from Britain to Egypt. The purpose was clearer than the details. The imperial government wanted a tax base it could recalculate, predict, and revisit. Regular assessment was meant to replace arbitrary emergency demands with a more dependable schedule. In principle, that could make taxation fairer. In practice, a careful register also gave the state a more precise map of what it expected to collect, even when drought, war, disease, or local decline made those expectations difficult to meet. The burden did not fall only on anonymous peasants. It passed through the men who governed Roman towns. Municipal councilors, often known as curiales, occupied an uncomfortable position between imperial orders and local reality. Their status could bring honor, influence, and access to office, but it also carried obligations. Councils had to allocate assessments, organize collection, and answer for shortfalls under rules that varied by time and place. Imagine the scene inside a provincial council chamber. Imperial demands written on official documents, local landowners requesting exemptions, farmers reporting damaged harvests, and administrators knowing that soldiers on a distant frontier still required supplies. The central government saw a quota. The town saw neighbors, patrons, rivals, and fields that might not produce what the register promised. Diocletian's famous edict on maximum prices, issued in AD 301, captured the state's frustration in stone. Surviving fragments list ceilings for an extraordinary range of goods, services, and wages. The preamble blamed greed and excessive prices, especially where soldiers and travelers were vulnerable. The edict is often presented as a foolish emperor ordering the economy to obey him. The reality was more revealing. Diocletian was trying to protect the purchasing power of the state and its army after years of monetary disorder. The measure appears to have been unevenly circulated and enforced, and it did not create lasting price stability. But its importance is not that Rome suddenly invented price controls. It is that the most powerful government in the Mediterranean was publicly admitting that its money markets and military needs were no longer aligning. Constantine later supplied a more durable answer at the top of the monetary system. His gold solidus, issued on a broad scale in the early 4th century, was struck at roughly 72 coins to a Roman pound of gold, giving each coin a weight of about 4.5 grams. Its stability made it one of the great monetary achievements of late antiquity. Gold could support taxation, high-level payments, diplomacy, and military finance across enormous distances. Yet the solidus did not place every Roman inside the same stable monetary world. Wealthy landowners, senior officials, merchants, and the state could operate through gold, while many ordinary people depended on base metal coins, payments in kind, local credit, and harvests. Monetary stabilization strengthened the empire, but it also revealed the unequal layers of the economy it was stabilizing. For a farming household, imperial recovery could feel less like rescue than a demand that the harvest carry the weight of survival. Grain had to feed the family, satisfy the landlord, provide seed for the next season, and meet public obligations. A bad year did not automatically cancel the assessment. Some people sold animals or tools. Some borrowed from wealthier neighbors. Some placed themselves under the protection of powerful landowners who could negotiate with officials more effectively than an isolated cultivator could. These pressures differed sharply by region and decade, and the late empire was not a single landscape of universal misery. There were prosperous estates, active ports, expanding cities, and wealthy churches. But the logic of the system remained: when the state felt endangered, it demanded more dependable access to the production beneath it. The remarkable fact is that the reforms worked. The 3rd century empire had fractured, but Diocletian and Constantine rebuilt imperial authority. Frontiers were defended, rival regimes were defeated, tax collection was reorganized, gold currency was stabilized, and Roman government entered the 4th century with formidable resources. This was not the recovery of the old empire in its old form. It was a denser, more militarized, more administratively demanding state. Its strength depended less on effortless abundance than on the government's ability to identify taxable land, compel local cooperation, move supplies, and preserve confidence among soldiers and elites. Rome had survived the crisis by constructing a stronger tax machine. But that machine had one fatal dependency. It could function only while the empire retained control of the provinces it was designed to assess. The next crisis would not merely attack Rome's borders. It would begin removing the taxpayers who paid for those borders. The system began to break at the Danube, but not because Rome suddenly encountered people it had never seen before. In AD 376, large groups of Goths appeared along the river, fleeing the violence created by the westward expansion of the Huns. They asked to enter Roman territory, and the Emperor Valens allowed at least some of them to cross. The decision was not irrational. Rome had settled outsiders before recruited foreign soldiers, and transformed migrants into taxpayers and military manpower. Properly managed, the newcomers might strengthen the empire. But reception required food registrations, transport supervision, and trustworthy officials. Instead, supply failures and exploitation turned a controlled admission into rebellion. Roman administrators reportedly profited from desperation, while hungry families sold possessions and even children for food. The frontier had not merely been breached, the state had failed to perform the administrative work that made incorporation possible. The crisis ended in catastrophe near Adrianople in AD 378. Valens marched against the Gothic force before all available Roman reinforcements had assembled, and the resulting battle destroyed a large part of his field army and killed the emperor himself. Adrianople did not instantly end Roman military power. The Eastern Empire survived rebuilt forces and eventually reached agreements with Gothic groups. But trained soldiers were expensive institutional assets. They represented years of recruitment equipment, discipline, command experience, and logistical investment. A government could mint more coins faster than it could create an experienced army. Replacing losses required new taxes, new recruits, and new bargains with armed men who understood that the empire needed them. The battle therefore mattered not only because Rome lost soldiers, but because the cost of rebuilding pushed the state further toward arrangements in which military loyalty depended on negotiation rather than unquestioned imperial command. When Theodosius I died in AD 395, the empire was governed from separate eastern and western courts under his young sons. This was not a single legal moment when one nation cleanly split into two new states. Roman unity remained an ideal, and emperors in both halves continued to claim authority within one imperial order. Yet the courts increasingly operated with different treasuries, commanders, bureaucracies, and strategic priorities. The Eastern government controlled wealthy provinces in Egypt and Syria and Anatolia, together with Constantinople and its defensible approaches. The West depended more heavily on Italy, Africa, Gaul, Spain, and Britain, while facing long continental frontiers and repeated political conflict. Cooperation remained possible, but resources sent to solve a Western emergency could weaken Eastern defenses, and Eastern officials did not always regard Western survival as worth unlimited expense. Imperial unity now had to compete with fiscal geography. The Western court eventually established itself at Ravenna, surrounded by marshes and protected by difficult approaches from land and sea. Militarily, the choice made sense. Politically and symbolically, it revealed the changing nature of Western government. The court was safer from sudden attack, but also removed from many of the provinces whose taxes and loyalty it needed. Reports of raids, tax arrears, rebellious generals, and displaced populations arrived through officials and messengers. Decisions were made behind defensive waters, while provincial communities faced threats more directly. The empire had not lost all administrative reach, but distance magnified mistrust. A landowner in Gaul or a town council in Britain still received imperial demands. What became less certain was whether imperial soldiers would arrive before an invading force, a regional usurper, or a local strongman offered a different form of protection. The most destructive pressure came from the repeated collision between civil war and frontier defense. Western commanders could not treat an imperial rival as a secondary problem, because a rival who controlled enough troops might seize the throne and execute the defeated regime. Forces needed along the Rhine or in Britain were therefore drawn into struggles over legitimacy. Stilicho, the most powerful Western general during the early reign of Honorius, attempted to manage invasions, court politics, and relations with the East while depending on a mixture of Roman and allied forces. His position made him indispensable and dangerous at the same time. In AD 408, he was arrested and executed after losing the political struggle at court. The removal of one commander did not cause the Western collapse, but it demonstrated a recurring pattern. The state repeatedly destroyed its own limited military leadership because political survival within the court seemed more urgent than institutional survival beyond it. During the Winter Crisis, traditionally dated to the end of AD 406, Vandals, Alans, and Sueves crossed the Rhine and moved into Gaul. The exact circumstances remain debated, and the image of one frozen river opening the gates to an entire continent is too simple. The deeper significance was administrative. Gaul contained cities, estates, workshops, roads, recruits, and tax districts that helped sustain Western power. When armies and armed groups contested a province, tax collection did not always stop immediately. Some officials continued working, some landowners paid whichever authority demanded payment, and some regions remained prosperous. But imperial revenue became less predictable. Roads were less secure. Assessments became harder to enforce. Local wealth could be redirected toward regional defense or seized by competing armies. A province did not need to become economically empty to become fiscally useless to the central government. It only had to pass beyond reliable imperial control. Britain exposed the same distinction with unusual clarity. Roman Britain did not vanish in one afternoon, nor did every town immediately become deserted. But in the early 5th century Western authority there ceased to function effectively. Troops and usurpers crossed to the continent, central commands lost force, and local communities confronted defense without dependable imperial support. Taxes that had once moved through Roman institutions no longer financed a Western army operating on the island. Coin circulation declined sharply in many areas. Large-scale public maintenance weakened and political authority fragmented. From Ravenna's perspective, Britain was not only a distant territory lost from a map, it was a network of taxpayers and military positions that no longer contributed to the imperial system. The West had one less province to defend, but it also had fewer resources with which to defend everything that remained. The sack of Rome by Alaric's forces in AD 410 became the era's great symbol. For people raised to believe in Rome's permanence, the entry of an enemy army into the city carried enormous psychological and religious meaning. Pagan and Christian writers argued over what the event proved. Refugees carried stories across the Mediterranean. Yet the sack was not the most important economic blow of the century. Rome was no longer the main seat of Western government. And the city's capture did not by itself destroy the imperial treasury. The larger danger lay in the continuing erosion of provinces, transport routes, and political obedience. A famous city could be plundered and later recover part of its life. A government that permanently lost the right to tax large territories surrendered the means of rebuilding its armies. Spectacle drew attention to Rome. Revenue was disappearing elsewhere. Faced with too many enemies and too few dependable forces, Western governments made agreements with armed groups inside imperial territory. These arrangements are often summarized by the word federates, but the category covered changing relationships rather than one uniform system. Some groups served under Roman command in exchange for pay-food land or recognition. Others retained their own leadership while accepting obligations to fight for the empire. Such bargains could be sensible. An emperor who could not expel a powerful group might redirect its soldiers against another enemy and restore order without funding an entirely new army. The immediate problem was solved by sharing authority. The long-term danger was that land tax, income recruitment, and military loyalty increasingly became attached to regional commanders and communities whose interests were not identical to those of Ravenna. Emergency cooperation could slowly become permanent political separation. This is where historians divide over emphasis. Edward Gibbon's famous account treated the Western fall as a long story of internal decline, weakened civic virtue, military dependence, and religious transformation. Later scholars challenged both his moral language and his tendency to describe centuries of change as deterioration from an idealized Roman past. Historians of late antiquity emphasized adaptation, cultural creativity, Christian institutions, and the survival of Roman practices under new rulers. That correction was necessary. The 5th century was not simply a dark curtain falling across Europe. Yet Peter Heather and other historians have insisted that external military pressure cannot be dissolved into a peaceful narrative of transformation. Armed groups captured provinces, defeated armies, and forced governments into unfavorable settlements. The crucial synthesis is fiscal invasions mattered because they removed resources, while internal weakness mattered because it prevented Rome from recovering them. The Vandals made that relationship devastatingly clear. After passing through Gaul and Spain, they crossed into North Africa in AD 429 under Geiseric. Their movement was not an aimless migration toward warm land. North Africa contained productive estates, prosperous cities, olive presses, grain fields, ports, and imperial properties. It was connected directly to Italy by short Mediterranean routes. Its agricultural exports helped feed urban populations, and its taxes supported the Western government. Roman forces attempted resistance, and the conflict did not produce an immediate uniform destruction of African economic life. In many areas, farming and trade continued. That continuity, however, could not comfort Ravenna. Wealth remaining in Africa was useful to the empire only if imperial officials could assess it, collect from it, and transport the proceeds. Economic production and imperial revenue were no longer the same thing. The capture of Carthage in AD 439 transformed the Western crisis. Geiseric gained a major port naval facilities access to African wealth and a position from which Vandal fleets could operate across the Western Mediterranean. The imperial government lost far more than prestige. It lost direct access to one of its richest remaining fiscal regions at the moment when Gaul, Spain, and Britain were already slipping from control. The state could respond by raising demands on the provinces that remained loyal, but this risked deepening local resistance and encouraging landowners to seek exemptions or private protection. It could recruit more soldiers, but soldiers required payment and supplies. It could attempt to recover Africa, but a naval expedition required ships, crews, grain horses, weapons, and enormous advance expenditure. Losing the province made reconquest necessary while simultaneously making reconquest harder to finance. For an ordinary community, the fiscal crisis appeared as a contradiction. Imperial collectors might still arrive even when imperial protection did not. A town damaged by raids could receive temporary tax relief, but the central state still needed revenue from somewhere. If one district could not pay, pressure shifted toward another. Landowners with influence might negotiate concessions. Smaller cultivators possessed fewer defenses against assessment, rent, and requisition. Some communities turned toward bishops, regional commanders, or powerful estates for protection, because those authorities were physically present. Loyalty did not disappear because people suddenly rejected Roman identity. It weakened when the imperial bargain ceased to function. The state continued to demand the resources of sovereignty while providing fewer of sovereignty's benefits. Each local decision to keep grain nearby, support a regional army, or negotiate with a new ruler made sense in isolation. Together, those decisions hollowed out the center. The resulting feedback loop was merciless. Less controlled territory meant fewer taxpayers, fewer recruits, fewer government estates, and less access to strategic ports. Lower revenue meant smaller or less dependable armies. Weaker armies forced the government to concede more territory, hire more Federate forces, and tolerate commanders whose loyalty depended on personal rewards. Those concessions reduced direct control over land and taxation even further. The process was not automatic, and alternatives still existed. Capable generals could win battles. Diplomacy could divide opponents. Eastern assistance could support recovery. The Western government remained alive, adaptive, and dangerous. But after Carthage, every failed campaign carried a greater cost because the reserves behind it were smaller. Rome now needed a decisive victory to recover its tax base. It would have to finance that victory from the diminished revenues created by losing the tax base in the first place. After AD 439, Carthage was no longer merely a province Rome had failed to protect. It became the center of a rival power. From its harbor, Gaiseric controlled ships, ports, estates, and revenue that had once strengthened the Western government. African agriculture did not suddenly disappear under Vandal rule. Farmers continued to cultivate land, merchants continued to trade, and Roman legal and social traditions survived in altered forms. But the taxes generated by that economy no longer flowed reliably into the Western treasury. Wealth remained in North Africa while Ravenna lost the authority to command it. The distinction was fatal. An empire did not survive simply because prosperous people still lived inside its former borders. It survived only when its institutions could turn their production into soldiers' fleet supplies and obedience. The Western treasury now faced obligations inherited from a much larger state while drawing revenue from a shrinking territory. Italy still contained enormous private wealth, but private wealth was not automatically available to the government. Gaul remained strategically and economically important, yet imperial control there was contested by local elites, Federate kingdoms, military commanders, and invading groups. Spain had become politically fragmented. Britain was gone. Africa had been lost. Every imperial administration therefore confronted the same impossible calculation. Raising taxes more aggressively risked resistance, evasion, and flight toward powerful patrons. Reducing military spending surrendered more territory. Hiring allied warriors provided immediate manpower, but required land revenue or political recognition. Rome had not literally exhausted every coin. It had lost the dependable relationship between what remained economically productive and what the central state could collect. Aetius demonstrated that Western military power had not vanished. For decades, he maneuvered among Roman troops, Hunnic allies, Federate armies, aristocratic interests, and rival courts. In AD 451, he assembled a coalition that confronted Attila's forces in Gaul at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. The battle's exact scale and strategic meaning remained debated, but it showed that a Western commander could still organize formidable resistance. It also revealed how much had changed. The army fighting under Roman direction was no longer supported solely through a secure, centrally controlled system of recruitment and taxation. Its effectiveness depended on negotiated alliances and the personal authority of a commander capable of holding them together. Roman command survived, but the state beneath it had become thinner, more regional, and more dependent on relationships that could disappear with one man. That dependence made court politics more destructive than ever. In AD 454, Emperor Valentinian III personally participated in the killing of Aetius. The following year, Valentinian was himself assassinated. These murders were not unusual in the long history of Roman imperial violence. What had changed was the government's ability to absorb them. Earlier emperors had killed generals and survived because deeper reserves of administrators, soldiers' revenue, and provincial loyalty remained available. The 5th century West had fewer replacements, Eliminating Aetius may have removed a political threat to the emperor, but it also removed one of the few commanders capable of coordinating the empire's divided military resources. The decision could appear rational inside the palace and disastrous from the perspective of the state. Once again, individuals protected their immediate positions by damaging the institutions on which their positions ultimately depended. The Vandal sack of Rome in AD 455 exposed the consequences. Geiseric's forces entered the city and carried away wealth and captives. The event was traumatic, but its deepest significance did not lie in the amount of treasure removed from palaces and temples. The raid demonstrated that the Western government could no longer prevent a power based in former Roman Africa from projecting force into the heart of Italy. Rome was being attacked with ships and resources drawn from territory that had once helped finance Rome's own security. The fiscal relationship had reversed. North Africa no longer supplied the empire that had governed it. It supplied the kingdom that threatened the empire. What looked like a military defeat was also the visible result of a transfer in taxation logistics and maritime power. Yet collapse was still not inevitable. Majorian, who became Western emperor in AD 457, challenged the image of late Roman rulers as passive figures waiting for extinction. He campaigned in Gaul, confronted the Visigoths' restored authority in parts of the western provinces, and issued laws aimed at strengthening government. His legislation addressed tax arrears, official corruption, damaged public buildings, and abuses that weakened the state's claim on provincial society. Majorian understood that military recovery and fiscal recovery could not be separated. Victories without functioning administration would not restore revenue. Tax demands without military protection would not restore loyalty. His reign represented one of the West's last serious attempts to rebuild the chain, connecting imperial authority, provincial production, and armed force. The central objective remained North Africa. Majorian prepared a fleet in Spain for an invasion that might recover the province and break the fiscal trap. The strategy was logical because no collection of minor victories in Gaul could replace what Carthage had provided. But before the expedition could sail successfully, the fleet was destroyed or captured in circumstances ancient sources associated with Vandal action and betrayal. Majorian was forced to abandon the campaign. One lost fleet would not have destroyed the empire during its strongest centuries. Ships could have been rebuilt, crews recruited, and another expedition financed. By AD 460, replacement capacity had become the problem. The Western government had invested scarce resources in creating the instrument of recovery, and the failure destroyed not only ships, but the revenue that had been consumed to build them. Majorian returned to Italy without the victory on which his broader restoration depended. In AD 461, the powerful commander Ricimer removed and killed him. Ricimer is sometimes presented as the hidden ruler who deliberately destroyed a succession of emperors. That interpretation assigns too much coherence to a political system, operating through fear and short-term survival. Ricimer had real power, but he also faced hostile courts, competing generals, aristocratic factions, federate armies, and a treasury unable to support every ambition. Replacing an emperor could remove an immediate rival. It could not restore Africa, enlarge the tax base, or rebuild the fleet. Western politics became a struggle over control of a state whose resources were diminishing with every struggle. The throne remained valuable enough to fight over, but too weak to guarantee that its victor could govern. The last enormous attempt came in AD 468. The Eastern Emperor Leo I joined the Western Emperor Anthemius in organizing a massive expedition against the Vandals. Fleets and armies approached Africa from several directions under commanders that included Basiliscus. The operation required ships, sailors, soldiers, weapons, food transport, animals, and financial commitments on a scale the Western government could no longer provide alone. Ancient accounts preserve extraordinary cost estimates, though converting them into reliable modern values is impossible. Their broad meaning is clear. Constantinople invested heavily because the African kingdom threatened both halves of the Roman world and because restoring Carthage offered the best chance of stabilizing the West. The expedition reached the African coast but ended in disaster. Geiseric requested time for negotiation, and then sent fire ships into the crowded Roman fleet. Vessels burned, formations broke, and much of the expedition's striking power was lost. Ancient writers blamed Basiliscus for hesitation or incompetence, though the failure cannot be reduced safely to one commander. Coordinating forces across the Mediterranean was inherently difficult. Intelligence was uncertain, and the Vandals possessed experienced naval leadership. What mattered most was the result. The empire had spent an immense concentration of money and material, attempting to recover the revenue source needed for long-term survival. Failure consumed the reserves that might have financed later action. The campaign designed to reverse the fiscal death spiral instead accelerated it. The contrast with Constantinople now became unavoidable. The Eastern Roman Empire faced invasions, religious conflict, court intrigue, military revolts, and heavy expenditure of its own. Its survival was not guaranteed by superior wisdom. But the Eastern government retained a broader and more defensible revenue base, including productive provinces in Anatolia, Egypt, Syria, and the Balkans. Constantinople occupied a strategic position, protected by formidable walls and access to maritime supply. The East also proved more successful at redirecting dividing or buying off threatening groups when direct military victory was too expensive. Most importantly, a failed campaign did not immediately strip the Eastern government of its capacity to raise another army. It possessed fiscal depth. The West increasingly possessed only fiscal emergencies. After AD 468, Western emperors changed rapidly while territorial authority contracted toward Italy and a few remaining enclaves. In AD 475, the military commander Orestes drove Emperor Julius Nepos from Italy and placed his young son Romulus on the throne. Romulus was not recognized by Constantinople, and Nepos continued to claim the imperial title from Dalmatia. The following year, soldiers serving in Italy demanded land. Orestes refused, and they rallied behind Odoacer. Orestes was defeated and killed. Romulus was removed, but spared. No new Western emperor was appointed in Italy. The imperial office that Augustus had created nearly 5 centuries earlier disappeared from the Western court with remarkably little resistance. But even AD 476 was less clean than the date suggests. Odoacer did not destroy every Roman institution and replace it with an entirely foreign system. The Senate remained. Roman officials continued to work. Taxes were still collected, laws administered, and estates cultivated. Odoacer ruled Italy while acknowledging the distant supremacy of the Eastern Emperor, and for a time the nominal position of Julius Nepos. Roman identity survived. Roman Christianity survived. Roman landowners survived. The Eastern Roman Empire continued from Constantinople. What ended was the existence of a Western imperial government able to command an independent treasury appoint and support its own army and recover provinces in the name of a Western emperor. The title disappeared because the fiscal and military structure that had once made the title powerful had already been dismantled. Archaeology reveals the price more clearly than the ceremony in Ravenna. In Roman Britain, the production and circulation of standardized pottery contracted dramatically. Coin use declined, public construction diminished, and many urban systems became difficult to maintain. In other Western regions, change was slower and more uneven. Parts of Italy, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa preserved cities, estates, churches, trade, and sophisticated craftsmanship. There was no single night when every road crumbled and every market closed. Yet Brian Ward Perkins has emphasized that the disappearance of imperial integration reduced the scale and availability of goods that ordinary people had once taken for granted. A well-made ceramic vessel could be an unremarkable household object under Rome, and a rare product after the networks that manufactured and distributed it had fragmented. This is why the debate between collapse and transformation cannot be solved with one word. Historians associated with the study of late antiquity correctly showed that Roman culture did not simply vanish. Christianity expanded legal traditions, endured elites, adapted, and successor rulers used Roman titles and institutions. But continuity in identity does not mean continuity in state capacity. A society can preserve its religion, language, memories, and aristocracy while losing the administrative power to maintain roads, standardize coinage, equip armies, support cities, and move inexpensive goods over great distances. The West was transformed culturally and politically. It also suffered genuine material and institutional collapse. Both statements can be true because they describe different layers of historical experience. The familiar story therefore gets one important thing. Right invasions mattered. Armed groups defeated Roman armies' occupied provinces and established new centers of power. But invasions alone do not explain why the West could not recover as Rome had recovered before. The decisive mechanism was the fiscal military feedback loop. Civil wars consumed armies. Territorial losses reduced taxes. Lower taxes weakened military capacity. Weaker armies required concessions that transferred more land and revenue away from the state. The process rewarded short-term bargains while making long-term restoration less affordable. Rome did not collapse because money secretly controlled history, and it did not fall because one emperor-general religion or people destroyed it. It collapsed when political violence and military loss severed the institutions that converted economic production into imperial power. The young Romulus, removed in AD 476, was therefore not the cause of Rome's fall. He was the final symbol of an office that could no longer pay for its own survival. The empire had once taken the harvests of distant provinces, recorded them in tax registers, transported them through ports and warehouses, and transformed them into soldiers standing along thousands of miles of frontier. By the 5th century, that chain had broken in the West. The fields still produced. The cities still remembered Rome. The title of emperor still carried prestige. But the government could no longer reliably turn any of them into power. The conventional story tells us when the Western throne disappeared. The economic story explains why almost no one could restore it. If this documentary changed how you understand the fall of Rome, subscribe to the Price of History docs like the video, and tell us in the comments which mattered most: external invasion, internal civil war, or the collapse of Rome's tax base.